Sing, sing for all of us. The command from Arthur Sterling, as sharp as shattered glass, sliced through the ballroom's murmur. He was pointing at a 12-year-old boy huddled near the service table, an easy target for his cruelty. But the millionaire didn't know that by forcing this humiliation, he was signing his own death warrant. The voice he was about to unleash would not bring shame to the boy, but ruin to a man who believed himself untouchable. In the center of the ballroom, beneath crystal chandeliers, Arthur smiled, a predator savoring the moment. "We're waiting," he pressed, and the silence grew heavy, dense, unbearable. The event was a charity auction, but the real item on display was Arthur Sterling himself. His mansion, a palace of marble and glass overlooking the city, was the perfect stage. Every detail, from the canapes on silver trays to the chamber orchestra playing softly in a corner, was a testament to his power. The guests, a hand-picked mix of investors with calculated smiles and socialites draped in silk and jewels, moved through the main hall. Photographers glided between them like sharks, capturing the glitter of the elite. Amidst it all, Eleanor moved with an almost invisible efficiency. She was part of the catering staff, her black and white uniform a stark contrast to the surrounding luxury. Her son, Samuel, 12 years old, quietly helped her, restocking napkins and collecting empty glasses, his head down and his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't belong in this place, and every glance he received was a reminder. The air in the ballroom was thin, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. Elena felt a sudden wave of dizziness, the result of 12 hours of non-stop work. She leaned discreetly against a pillar, a hand to her forehead. Samuel noticed instantly. Leaving his tray on a service table, he crossed the room towards the bar, on a single mission to get a glass of water for his mother. He slipped between the clusters of people, a small ghost in a world of giants. The center of the hall was dominated by a red velvet pedestal, where an antique violin, a Stradivarius, rested under a single beam of light. It was the auction's main item, worth more than the house where Samuel and Elena lived. As he passed the pedestal, one of the investors gestured broadly while laughing at a joke, his arm nudging Samuel aside. The boy stumbled, his shoulder lightly brushing the base of the pedestal. The violin trembled for a moment. No one seemed to notice, except for one pair of eyes, the eyes of Arthur Sterling. "Stop the music!" Arthur's voice rang out, not loud, but with an authority that silenced the orchestra and conversations at once. The auctioneer, who was about to start the bidding on the violin, froze. All faces turned to Arthur, who was now walking slowly toward Samuel. The boy was paralyzed, the glass of water forgotten in his hand. "We have an art connoisseur among us," Arthur said, his tone falsely friendly. He stopped in front of Samuel, looking him up and down. Or perhaps just a clumsy one. A few guests chuckled. Eleanor rushed to them, her face pale with dread. "Mr. Sterling, I'm so sorry, it was an accident." "He didn't mean any harm." Arthur ignored her completely, his focus entirely on the boy. "What's your name, kid?" Samuel couldn't answer. His throat was dry. "Cat got your tongue?" Arthur insisted, his patience wearing thin. "His name is Samuel," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Please, he was just getting me some water." Arthur finally turned to Elena, a contemptuous smile forming on his lips. "Ah, the catering staff, of course. We let you into our homes, near our valuables, and this is what we get in return: incompetence." The humiliation was public, deliberate. The investors watched with cold interest. The socialites whispered behind their fans, their phones already starting to rise to record the scene. "It was nothing, sir. The violin barely moved," Elena said, desperate. "Nothing?" Arthur repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That instrument is worth more than both of your lives. The mere vibration from a careless touch can affect its soul, its acoustics. But how would you know that?" He turned to the audience. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, a perfect example of why certain barriers must exist." The venom in his words was palpable. Samuel felt hundreds of eyes on him, judging, condemning. To calm himself, an old trick his father had taught him, he began to hum quietly, almost without a sound. It was a complex melody, a fragment of a Bach aria his father loved. The sound was minuscule, but in the heavy silence of the room, Arthur heard it. His eyes narrowed, and a new kind of cruelty dawned on his face. "What's this? The little mouse has a voice?" he mocked. He leaned in, cupping his hand behind his ear. "Don't be shy. Sing louder." Samuel stopped humming, his face burning with shame. "So that's it," Arthur said, snapping his fingers as if he'd had an epiphany. "We've found a way for you to pay for your mistake." He straightened up, projecting his voice for everyone to hear. "Since you don't have money, you will pay us with your talent." He dragged the word out with sarcasm. "You will sing for all of us. Now." The absurd proposal hung in the air. Elena looked at Arthur, incredulous. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," he replied, his grin widening. "It's simple. One song. A little performance to entertain my guests and compensate for the stress you've caused us." He turned back to Samuel, his gaze as hard as steel, and that's when he gave the order that started it all. "Sing. Sing for all of us." Eleanor stepped in front of Samuel, a fragile shield against Arthur's cruelty. "Please, Mr. Sterling, he's just a child. Don't do this to him," she pleaded, her voice low and urgent. Arthur looked at her as if she were an insect. "The choice isn't yours," he said coldly. He raised his voice again, addressing the room, turning the humiliation into a spectacle. "The offer is simple and I'd say quite generous. One song in exchange for your job. Either the boy sings now and we forget this little incident, or I will personally ensure the only kitchen you step into in this city is your own." The wager was cast, loud and clear. The condition was measurable, the deadline immediate. The guests leaned forward, captivated. This was better than the auction. The red recording lights of dozens of phones captured every second. Samuel looked at his mother's terrified face, and then at Arthur's victorious smirk. He felt the weight of every stare, the crushing pressure to submit, to break. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A knot of anger and powerlessness had formed in his throat, choking any melody. The silence stretched, taut like a violin string. To Arthur, that silence was a confession of defeat. He had won. With a theatrical gesture of disdain, he gave a subtle nod. Two security guards, massive men in dark suits, began to move toward them. The catering manager, a man with a tired face, approached Eleanor. "Elena, I'm sorry. Your things will be at the front gate. Please leave." The dismissal was instant, clinical and brutal. There were no more words. The guards escorted them not with force, but with a presence that made it clear resistance was futile. The sea of guests parted to let them pass, and they walked the corridor of shame, the anonymous faces and phone flashes following them like vultures. No one said a word. No one intervened. They were invisible, disposable. The cold night air hit them as they passed through the massive doors. Behind them, the heavy, metallic sound of the iron gates closing echoed down the silent street. Outside, alone in the darkness, the music and laughter of the party were just a distant murmur, coming from a world that had just spit them out 3 years earlier. Their apartment was small, with only 2 rooms, but it never felt cramped. The walls were lined with crooked shelves, overflowing with books and yellowed sheet music. An old upright piano, with a few chipped keys, held the place of honor in the small living room, and the air smelled of old paper, polished wood, and the lemon tea his father David made every afternoon. David wasn't a stage musician. He was a teacher. His passion wasn't in the applause, but in the precise moment a student finally understood the soul of a composition. And his most dedicated student was Samuel. On that rainy afternoon, the grey light filtering through the window illuminated dust motes dancing in the air as David explained the diaphragm. "It's not about shouting, Sam," he would say, his voice calm and resonant. "It's about filling this space." He tapped his son's stomach with his fingertips. "This is your engine. The sound isn't born in the throat, it's born here. The throat is just the gateway." Samuel, then 9 years old, tried to imitate his father's posture, shoulders back, chest open. He took a deep breath, feeling the air expand his lungs, and released a long, sustained note. The sound was pure, but still childish, lacking the power he so desired. "Better?" David smiled, a smile that warmed the entire room. "But you're thinking about the note. Don't think, feel. The music already exists, son. We are just the antennas that pick it up and transmit it." He turned and picked up a small metallic object from the top of the piano. It was a steel tuning fork, simple and unadorned, worn from constant use. It didn't have the shine of silver or gold, but to David it was more precious than any jewel. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. "Do you know what this is?" Samuel nodded. "For tuning." "Exactly. But it's more than that," said David. "It's a reminder of the truth. Before you sing the wrong note, the uncertain note, the frightened note, you listen for the true note, pure, perfect." He tapped the tuning fork lightly on the piano's wood and brought it close to Samuel's ear. The soft, perfect hum of the A note filled the silence between them. "Listen, it's honest. It doesn't try to be more than it is. It's the foundation. Everything starts here." He placed the tuning fork in Samuel's small hand. The metal was cool and heavy. "This is yours now." Samuel looked at the object, then at his father, his eyes wide. "But, son, it's yours." "And now it's yours," David insisted. He knelt to be at his son's level, his eyes serious but filled with immense love. "People will try to tell you who you are. They'll judge you by your clothes, by our home, by the money we don't have. They will try to put you in a box and give you a label." He took Samuel's hand, closing the boy's fingers around the tuning fork. "But they can never touch what's inside here." He touched Samuel's chest. "Your voice is your inheritance, son. It's the one treasure that no one, ever, can steal from you." In that moment, the rain outside seemed to stop, and the only thing that existed was the promise held in those words, sealed by the weight of steel in a boy's hand. The morning light filtering through the kitchen window was grey and merciless, revealing the fine cracks in the wall and the weariness on Elena's face. The sun didn't seem to be shining for them that day. She had been on the phone since 7 a.m., her voice shifting from hopeful to tense and finally to a veiled despair. "I understand, Sonia, but it was a misunderstanding. Yes, I know what he said. No, of course, I don't want to cause you trouble. Thanks anyway." She hung up, the click of the button sounding like a final verdict. It was the fourth call, the fourth rejection. The network of contacts she had spent years building had dissolved in a single night. Arthur Sterling's word was more powerful than the truth, faster than any gossip. The entire city already knew. No one would hire her. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. From the doorway, Samuel watched in silence. He hadn't cried the night before, nor had he complained. He absorbed the blow with a maturity that frightened his mother, but inside, the humiliation had solidified into something hard and cold. Determination. Seeing his mother break was the spark that lit the flame. He turned and went to his room, a tiny space that barely fit his bed and a small desk. He opened a drawer and took out the steel tuning fork. The metal felt cold in his hand, but its weight was familiar, comforting. It was an anchor, a piece of his father's courage. Under his bed, in a shoebox, were David's music sheets, their edges worn with use. He took one of them, the Bach aria he had been humming the night before, and placed it along with the tuning fork in his backpack. He approached his mother in the kitchen, who was still sitting at the table, lost in thought. "I'm going out for a bit," he said, his voice firm. Elena looked up, her eyes red. "Where are you going, sweetie?" "To fix this," he replied, and before she could protest, he was out the door. Meanwhile, miles away in a top-floor office of a glass and steel skyscraper, Arthur Sterling was laughing on the phone. "No, can you believe it? The little catering rat," he was saying to a partner on the other end of the line. "The mother made a scene. It was hilarious. I threw them both out on the street. You have to teach these people their place every now and then." For him, the incident was already an amusing anecdote, a trivial exercise of power. He gave no more thought to Samuel or Elena. They were irrelevant. footnotes in his busy day of closing deals and moving millions. He had no idea that the seed of his own ruin was, at that very moment, crossing the city on a crowded bus. Samuel got off in an older neighborhood where the buildings were lower and the streets noisier. He walked to a modest storefront with a carved wooden sign that read, "Westwood Music Academy." The place smelled of violin rosin and dust. Inside, a man with graying hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose was tuning a cello. It was Maestro Gallo, an old friend of his father's. He looked up as Samuel entered. "Can I help you?" "Maestro Gallo?" Samuel asked, his heart pounding. "I'm Samuel, David Chen's son." The name made the maestro pause. He set down his bow and looked at Samuel more closely, recognition dawning in his eyes. "David, of course. I'm sorry about your father, kid. He was a good man, a true musician." "I know," said Samuel. "That's why I'm here." He took a deep breath and told him everything. The party, the accident, the humiliation, Arthur Sterling's wager. He didn't present himself as a victim, but as someone with a score to settle. Finally, he took the tuning fork out of his backpack. "My father gave me this. He said my voice was my inheritance." Gallo looked at the simple object, then at the determination in the boy's eyes. He sighed, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "What do you want me to do, Samuel? Arthur Sterling is a powerful man." "I don't want you to do anything," Samuel said, his voice clear and unwavering. "I just need you to listen." Maestro Gallo sighed, a sound that seemed to carry decades of disappointment with the world. He looked at the boy before him, so small and fragile, and then at the sheet music in his hands. "All right, Samuel. Show me what you've got." He sat down at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys, expecting a disaster. He expected a childish, shaky voice, perhaps in tune, but nothing to justify such a fuss. It was only loyalty to David's memory that made him proceed. Samuel nodded. He didn't look at the maestro, but at a fixed point on the opposite wall, a place all his own. He took the tuning fork from his pocket, tapped it gently on his pant leg, and brought it to his ear. The pure, honest note cut through his anxiety. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his diaphragm, just as his father had taught him. And then he sang. The first note wasn't loud, but it filled the room instantly. It had a clarity, a resonance that made Gallo snap his head up, his eyes wide. This was not the voice of a boy. It was the voice of an old soul, carrying a purity and a pain that no 12-year-old should know. As Samuel moved through the Bach aria, the complexity of the piece unfolding in his voice, the maestro felt a shiver run down his spine. His fingers, once hesitant, now danced across the keys, no longer just accompanying but dueling, conversing with this phenomenal voice. He saw David in Samuel's posture, in the way he phrased each passage, in the restrained passion that exploded in the crystal-clear high notes. This wasn't talent. It was a gift, a musical miracle hidden in a poor neighborhood of this indifferent city. When the last note hung in the air, vibrating with raw emotion, the silence that followed was deeper than any applause. Gallo remained motionless, his hands still on the piano, staring at Samuel as if seeing him for the first time. "My God," he whispered. In that moment, anger replaced shock. The image of Arthur Sterling, an ignorant barbarian trying to humiliate this, trying to break this spirit, was a profanity. The injustice was not just against a child and his mother, it was against beauty itself, against art. And Gallo, a man who had lived his life in service of music, could not let it stand. He stood up, his mind racing. He didn't have Sterling's money or influence, but he had something more valuable: credibility. He picked up the phone. "Isabel, it's Gallo. Cancel whatever you're doing tonight." Isabel Vance was the city's top cultural journalist, a cynical woman who had seen it all. "Gallo, what happened? Did some famous tenor have a meltdown?" she asked, her voice tinged with boredom. "Something much better," the maestro said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "I want you to go to Arthur Sterling's party." There was a pause on the line. to a phony philanthropist's party. Did I lose a bet? She scoffed. Trust me, Gallo said. There's going to be a surprise performance. Something you don't see every day. Bring your best photographer. And, Isabel, don't be late. Isabel's curiosity was piqued. Gallo was not a man for exaggeration. She made a few calls. The first was to a renowned music critic. Are you going to Sterling's party? Keep an eye out. Gallo told me there's something special happening. The intrigued critic agreed. The news began to spread like wildfire in whispers. In offices, in cafes, in the elite's beauty salons, phones began to buzz. Did you hear? It seems the boy Sterling humiliated yesterday is actually going to perform. The story changed its tone. Mockery gave way to a morbid curiosity. What was once an embarrassing incident was now a billed event, a spectacle with Maestro Gallo's seal of approval. The same guests who had laughed and filmed the humiliation now prepared for the second act, no longer as judges, but as an eager audience, hungry for the drama to come. The trap was set, and the stage was the lion's own den. The ballroom at the Sterling mansion was even more crowded than the night before, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The soft music from the orchestra couldn't mask the electricity in the air. The whispers had grown into a nearly palpable expectation. Arthur, feeling himself the center of this universe, interpreted the buzz as a tribute to his own importance. When one of his aides informed him that the catering kid was at the entrance accompanied by Maestro Gallo, Arthur smirked. Their audacity amused him. He saw it as a pathetic attempt to save face, and he decided he would give them the stage they so desperately wanted. It would be the climax of his party, the final punchline. He stepped onto the small stage, set up near the panoramic windows, and called for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice slick with false generosity, "it appears we have an artist among us who insists on a second chance. Please give a round of applause for our little prodigy." The mockery was evident, and a few guests chuckled, but most remained silent, their phones already raised, ready to capture whatever was about to happen. The side doors opened. Maestro Gallo entered first, walking with a quiet dignity toward the grand piano. He didn't look at the audience. His focus was absolute. Just behind him came Samuel. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, just a simple white shirt and dark pants. But he walked with his head held high. He didn't look frightened, only focused. He stopped beside the piano, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces for a moment, meeting Arthur's gaze, who watched him with a sneer. Samuel didn't react. He turned to Gallo, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Then, in a gesture no one understood, Samuel took the steel tuning fork from his pocket. He tapped it lightly against the piano and brought it to his ear. In that instant, the noisy ballroom, the curious faces, the arrogant millionaire, it all disappeared. There was only the note. Pure. Perfect. His father's inheritance. He took a deep breath. Gallo played the first chords, a soft, melancholy introduction that silenced the last of the whispers. And then Samuel's voice rose. It was not the voice of a child trying to sing. It was a force of nature, a sound so pure, so powerful, and so charged with deep emotion that it seemed to make the very air vibrate. He was singing Nessun Dorma, one of the most difficult and iconic arias in the operatic repertoire, a choice of unthinkable audacity. The first phrase hit the audience like a shockwave. The mocking smiles froze and morphed into masks of disbelief. The phones that had been recording a humiliation were now documenting a miracle. Isabel Vance, the journalist standing near the bar, slowly lowered her jaw. The music critic beside her closed his eyes, like a devotee in prayer, absorbing every note. Arthur Sterling, from his privileged spot, felt the smile melt from his face. This couldn't be real. The sound coming from that frail boy was impossible. Samuel was no longer there. He was inside the music, every note a weapon, every phrase a declaration. His voice soared, filling every corner of the ballroom, climbing past the crystal chandeliers and echoing against the glass panes that looked out on the sleeping city below. He wasn't singing for them. He was singing for his father, for his mother, for every time he had felt invisible. And then came the climax. The final note, the vincero, held with a power and clarity that defied logic. The sound hung in the air for a second that felt like an eternity, a cry of victory that sealed the fate of everyone in that room. When the note finally faded, no one moved. No one breathed. The silence was absolute, total, a vacuum filled only by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The proof had been presented. It was objective, irrefutable, and recorded on hundreds of phones. The power, in that moment of stunned silence, had changed hands. The silence was broken not by one, but by hundreds of hands clapping at once. It was a thunderous, visceral ovation that shook the crystal chandeliers. The once apathetic and cynical guests were on their feet, their faces transformed by awe and shock. But before Arthur Sterling could compose himself and try, somehow, to hijack the moment for himself, the first sanction, the social one, struck him. The music critic, a man feared for his acidic pen, was the first to move. He walked toward the stage, the applause parting for him. "Unbelievable," he said aloud, for all to hear. "This is not a talent. It is a phenomenon, a rough diamond of the highest quality." He turned to the crowd. What we have witnessed here was the birth of a star. The validation was absolute, coming from the highest authority in the room. Immediately, Isabel Vance, the journalist, sprang into action. She activated the live stream on her tablet, the feed from her culture blog being watched by thousands. With a microphone in hand, she approached Arthur, who was still paralyzed, the fake smile frozen on his face. "Mr. Sterling, a question for our live audience," she said, her voice professional but with a sharp glint in her eyes. "A revelation like this is a landmark for the city. As a known patron of the arts, how did you discover this young prodigy? Where have you been hiding him for so long?" The camera was tight on Arthur's face. The question was a perfect trap. He couldn't admit the truth, that he had tried to humiliate the boy, but he also couldn't lie convincingly. Panic flickered in his eyes. "Well, I have an eye for talent," he stammered, trying to form a coherent sentence. "I saw the potential in him from the very first moment." The lie was so weak, so transparent, that a murmur of contempt rippled through the crowd. Everyone there had witnessed the cruelty of the previous night. The recordings on their phones were the proof. It was then that the material sanction, the one that truly mattered in Arthur's world, fell like a guillotine. A foreign investor, Mr. Tanaka, a quiet man who controlled a billion-dollar investment fund, had been observing the scene with an impassive expression. He had witnessed the humiliation of Elena and Samuel the night before and had been disgusted. Now, seeing Arthur's blatant lie, he made his decision. He leaned toward his aide and spoke a few words in Japanese, his voice low but final. The aide nodded and discreetly took out his phone to send a message, but Tanaka made sure the sanction was seen. He walked up to Arthur, who was still under the glare of Isabel's camera. "Sterling-san," he said with a slight accent, "my fund values integrity and honor. What I saw here tonight was a great performance and a great dishonor." He gave a slight bow. "Consider our investment deal terminated." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked toward the exit, his aide trailing behind. The contract, worth $200 million, had just evaporated into thin air. The news spread through the room like an electric shock. Arthur's fall was no longer just social. It was financial, catastrophic. The power he so cherished, built on a foundation of arrogance, had shattered in public. The crowd, once a monolith of scorn, now swarmed around Samuel. The music critic gestured animatedly, talking about conservatories in Europe. Isabel, the journalist, was already scheduling an exclusive interview. Photographers jostled for the best angle of the boy wonder. Amid it all, Samuel searched for just one face. He found his mother, Eleanor, leaning against the piano, the tears streaming down her face no longer from pain, but from a pride so overwhelming it left her breathless. Samuel broke away from the group and ran to her, hugging her tightly. In that embrace was the night's true prize. On the other side of the room, the epicenter of power had become a vacuum. Arthur Sterling stood alone. The guests who had once fawned over him now averted their gazes, walking past him as if he were a ghost. The financial ruin was a rumor that had already become fact, and no one wanted to be associated with failure. Pale, his mask of arrogance shattered, he saw Samuel and Elena moving to a quieter corner near a balcony. With the last remnants of his former authority, he walked toward them. His approach made Elena stiffen, ready to protect her son again, but Samuel placed a hand on her arm, calming her. He was no longer afraid. Arthur stopped in front of them, no longer a giant but a diminished man. "Kid," he began, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "That was impressive. I didn't know." He searched for words but found only empty excuses. "Look, what Mr. Tanaka said, it was a misunderstanding. I can fix it, and I can help you. I can give you everything, the best teachers, a scholarship, whatever you want." The offer was pathetic. He still thought everything could be bought, fixed with money. Samuel looked at him, his eyes clear and serene. There was no anger in them, no triumph. There was only a quiet dignity that Arthur could never comprehend. Slowly, Samuel raised his hand and opened it, revealing the worn steel tuning fork. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, the object seeming to glow under the soft light. "You don't understand," Samuel said, his voice quiet but clear as a perfect note. "You can't give me anything." He glanced at the piece of metal in his hand, then back at the millionaire's crumbling face. "My voice is my inheritance." He paused, letting his father's words echo in the space between them. "It's the one treasure that no one, not even you, can steal from me." He didn't wait for an answer. He put the tuning fork back in his pocket, took his mother's hand, and without a second glance, turned his back on Arthur Sterling and the world he represented. 1 year later, the grand facade of the city's municipal theatre was illuminated, its marble columns gleaming under the spotlights. Stretched between them, a massive banner announced the season's grand premiere, not with the name of a foreign tenor, but with 2 words that now electrified the classical music world: Samuel Chen. Inside, in the front row of a red velvet box, Eleanor watched, her face bathed in silent tears of pure joy, the concert program trembling in her hands. Her son's rise had been meteoric, a legend told in newspapers and on television shows. In one of those newspapers, forgotten on a park bench, a small note in the business section reported the final auction of Arthur Sterling's assets, including a mansion overlooking the city, sold to cover the debts of his bankruptcy. On stage, under the intense glare of a single spotlight, a black grand piano gleamed. The pianist waited. The audience held its breath, and on the polished wood next to the sheet music rested a small, simple, worn steel object, the tuning fork. It wasn't a lucky charm, but a starting point, a constant reminder of the inheritance that had brought him here. It was proof that the true treasure, the one no one could ever steal, was about to fill that theatre with its voice. If this story of justice and triumph moved you, leave a like to show your support. Comment which city you're watching from. I make a point to read and reply to as many comments as possible. And if you believe that true talent always conquers arrogance, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this one. But don't go just yet. On the screen, I've left 2 other incredible stories for you to choose from. Click on one of them and I'll see you in the next video.